Assalamu alaikum, everybody. My name is Kulsum Ahmed. I'm really happy to be the moderator for today's session on stunting. I wanted to first start by introducing the panel, even though I think you probably know most of them very well. Dr. Ghazala Mansuri, who is a lead economist in the Poverty Reduction and Equity Group at the World Bank. Then we have Dr. Nousheen Zaidi, who is director of the Cancer Research Center at the University of Punjab. She's also director of Action Research Collective, an NGO, and you're going to hear more about their work today. And then, of course, we have Dr. Sanval Nasim. He's an assistant professor of economics at Colby College. So I wanted to just explain a little bit what our goal is. Hopefully we'll explain to you what stunting is, clear up any misconceptions about it just being something to do with lack of food and only affecting certain people, certain segments of the population. I hope we'll also talk a little bit about solutions. And actually, we literally are going to run through the panel, and what we would like to do is to use the fact that all of you all are here, and there have been such excellent discussions the last 2 days, and there are so many lessons also deriving from those sessions, which actually feed into this discussion. So I'm literally put the questions up. The first is asking you all, because we're going to turn to you and hopefully get a discussion going. Can one indeed grow with a 40% stunting rate? So hopefully you will answer that question, better understanding what a 40% stunting rate is. And then secondly, what do we need to do to reduce stunting? And there I hope you're going to bear in mind some of the excellent papers we've heard in different sessions. There's Farah, I heard one talking about women and completing secondary education, or Stefan's, Durkon's excellent talk yesterday in the morning, talking about how you do it in a political context, or even yesterday's discussion on Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, where Bangladesh have done this, right? India is behind, like us, but we are worse than them on the stunting rate, but Bangladesh has done it. So, and then there's a lot of other research since just yesterday, today, that I've heard, which also has a bearing on this. So that's why I hope you'll be telling us a lot of things and we'll have a discussion. So just with that, I would like to invite Ghazala to get us started, please. And we literally are going to run through the presentations 15 minutes at a time. I'm going to move off so that you have space.
I don't think I need this, right? Because I'm only working
yeah,
off of
yeah.
this. Okay, great. So very happy to be here. And my presentation actually starts with this very provocative, I thought, title. I actually decided to go this way because I think we need to bring this conversation together. The conversation we're all having on growth and the challenges of growth, and then we have this conversation on human capital, and those conversations don't really come together, right? So the idea was to sort of bring these two conversations together and to show that these things are intimately linked to each other, right? So basically, this is a very quick view of Pakistan. The last 3 decades, no progress on child stunting. And this is happening at a time when extreme poverty, measured roughly as $1.90 or now $2.10 per person per day, has declined dramatically in Pakistan. Our poverty line is now at a lower middle income poverty line, and we're at about 24% on that, on a lower middle income poverty line. So Pakistan has grown faster than any other South Asian country in terms of reducing poverty. But it has done so with absolutely no success in reducing child stunting, and also has extremely high levels of diarrhea that have shown no movement. Very unusual relative to other countries, right? So let's just, keeping that background in mind, we'll move right into what is stunting, right? So as Kulsum began by saying, people often say things like, Pakistanis are reasonably tall, we can't possibly be stunted. The data is wrong. I've had people at the bank tell me that. okay? So stunting has nothing to do with your adult height, or well, I shouldn't say that. That's an extreme view. It has very little to do with your adult height. There are 500 genes that control your adult height. You inherit them from your parents, right? But every single baby grows at exactly the same rate from gestation to the first 24 months, provided the same conditions, right? That allows us to actually track their growth and actually to see deficits in a credible way and to ascribe them to certain growth challenges, right? So simply because every baby, human baby, will grow at exactly the same rate, right? Which is why at birth we can take a test of, we can measure their brain size and see whether there's a deficit that alerts us. We can measure their birth weight and say, okay, something is wrong, because we're expecting certain norms to be satisfied at that stage, right? So it's really, we're talking about height for age, which is how we measure stunting, primarily in the first 2 years of life, with this idea in mind. So what's happening in the first 2 years of life and gestation, right? For one thing, 80% of brain growth is happening, right? So if you look at this figure, higher cognition function, receptive language area, speech production, seeing, hearing, all of these are peaking, right? By the 24th month, you've peaked on everything, including higher cognitive function, right? The brain is about 12% of body weight at this stage, but it's accounting for 50% of what's called the basal metabolic rate, your calories consumed at rest, right? It's extremely hungry. It's very hungry because it's got to do all of this growth within a very short period of time. The window of opportunity is very small, right? What does an infant need at this time? An infant needs many things, as we know, at this time, right? But critically on nutrition, dietary adequacy, enough calories, because the brain needs glucose. It's like literally living on that stuff and growing very rapidly. It needs not just adequacy, but it needs the right nutritive content. So diversity and quality of nutrition is also extremely important. And then there's a third thing, which is the body should be able to absorb that nutrition, use it, right? None of these can be taken for granted. So if you just take care of adequacy, so what does poverty do? Poverty tends to take care of the adequacy issue in many cases. Poverty goes down, there are more calories available, right? Children get better fed. It's not going to help if the dietary quality and diversity is very poor. It's going to help a bit, but not enough, right? You won't have what you would call sort of this acute problems of sort of starvation, or what we would see in terms of wasting. That will go down. By the way, in Pakistan, if I go back to the figure, you'll see wasting has declined quite significantly, consistent with a decline in poverty, right? But not stunting, okay? So let's come to the third piece. So there's adequacy, there's quality and diversity, and then there's the body's absorptive capacity. This last piece has been entirely missed in Pakistan, like zero, right? So basically, we've done there's quite a bit of understanding on adequacy. I would say everybody's like, the people are poor, so therefore they're stunting, or, they're not getting enough calories. There's a little bit of understanding on quality, but mainly in the space of micronutrients, additives, and things like that. Not in terms of foundational diversity and quality, which I'll talk about, and absolutely zero attention on the body's ability to absorb nutrients. Part of this is that some of the research is relatively new. By new, I don't mean yesterday. I mean it's been growing over the last 2.5, 3 decades, but really escalating in the last decade as the research on the microbiome has grown, right? So as a researcher, we've understood more about the human microbiome. We've understood much more about chronic malnutrition. All of this. So part of this is what we now call environmental enteric dysfunction. This is a subclinical condition. Basically, your intestines, the villi of the small intestine get damaged because of the entry of all sorts of essentially contaminants into the system that cause bacterial contamination. They damage and sort of like, in a way, flatten the villi. Once these villi are flattened, the child cannot absorb nutrients. The problem here is, even if there's adequacy now, and even if there's quality and diversity, hypothetically, if there's EED, if there's inflammatory conditions going on in the body, if the immune system is damaged, the child won't be able to absorb nutrients, right? So what does that do? If the child can't absorb adequate nutrients at this stage, or doesn't get enough nutrients because of adequacy or diversity, there's cognitive damage. Enough neural connections don't get made. This is irreversible. It cannot be repaired at age 3 suddenly by giving a better diet or fixing the environment. The window of opportunity is very short, which is why we talk about the 1,000 days. Right? After the 1,000 days, the opportunity is done, more or less. It causes immune dysfunction, not just brain damage or not just cognitive deficits. It also makes the body overall much weaker. If you can't absorb nutrients, your whole body is weaker. You get more illnesses through life. There's in some cases, it's mortality, but in the vast majority of cases, it's just morbidity. You just get consistent chronic infections, repeat infections, and so forth. And then this carries on into adulthood. It's permanent in that sense, right? So you basically have, these kids have lower educational attainment, just the capacity to learn is just weakened, right? There's reduced labor productivity because their whole body is weak. They're subject to illness, they're weaker, they tend to get ill much more quickly. They develop lots of chronic health conditions later in life. So Pakistan is among the countries with the highest rates of type 2 diabetes, for example, now, right? It's not just because of what we're consuming, it's because there is already you're set up. Later life caloric availability will actually predispose you to acquiring type 2 diabetes, right? Even if it's nothing to do with what you did, it happened very early in life. You're just predisposed, right? Similarly, predisposed to cardiovascular disease, predisposed to higher blood pressure, predisposed to a slew of immune conditions. All these things of what we call the whole slew of immune diseases related that are chronic in nature. You'll get that. Which means societal healthcare costs will only get worse, right, over time. And then, of course, at the end of the day, that impairs your capacity to grow. Hence, we need to talk about these two things together. Right? These massive deficits in human capital that we are building, legitimate growth, sustained growth at least is not possible. You may grow for a little while, right? But with 40% stunting rate, you're not going to grow sustainably over any length of time. Climate extremes are going to worsen this. Why? Because we are heading for a time when this whole region, all of South Asia, will be warmer than the global average. So if the global average is 2 degrees, this region will be much warmer. Extreme heat conditions, lower labor productivity in any case, even for everybody. But for those who are already weakened, it will reduce labor productivity much more. Their bodies can't take it, right? So the capacity to survive extreme heat conditions is going to be much lower for these guys. And of course, their productivity and those. So I'm going to go very quickly now because the 3 points I want to make, and let me just make them. One is that environmental conditions are the foundation on which any reduction in stunting can happen. They're not the only thing that's important, as I said, but environmental conditions are foundational. So let me finish that, and we won't worry so much about the slides. I'll go through them really quickly. I talked about environmental enteric dysfunction. What causes environmental enteric dysfunction? So you have conception, okay? At conception, the mother arrives at conception already weak, right? She has a poor diet, but she faces poor sanitation, hygiene, and water conditions. That's your environment. There are 2 aspects of the environment that are critical. One is the water, sanitation, and hygiene conditions. The other is the quality and diversity of food, right? And in water, sanitation, and hygiene, I'm also including all of the massive number of effluents and chemicals we are putting into agriculture, right? So the nitrates in chemical fertilizer, the pesticides, all of this. It's environmental conditions, right? Which cause a lot of contamination. So you're already starting conception disadvantage, and then you go quickly, you're born, you're probably more likely, by the way, if your mother was compromised, that infant is more likely to be already born stunted, which means if we record that you are stunted at birth, at age 2, the odds of that reversal are very low. So that very, very high correlation between birth outcomes and age 2 outcomes, right? And then it goes on like this. You've reached 2 years, basically your window is now closing. If you arrive at 2 years with a height for age deficit, then that's it. It's permanent, right? Adult height deficit will be about 2 to 2.5 inches for girls, to 3 to 3.5 inches for boys, right? But the mass of your adult height will be determined by your genetic factors, right? But this has already happened, and this is much more inside than it is outside. Is my point, right? Okay, so then so it goes on like this, right? The issue. So this is sort of the critical, what we call the 1,000-day period. If I go quickly through this, there's very little you can do at school age. Tiny window of opportunity for adolescent girls in particular. We really need to be focusing on them, right? And then at adulthood, similarly, you come. There's preconception. Mother's already arriving stunted. Child is going to be stunted. All right. So this is sort of the life cycle view. I don't want to spend any time on this. I'm going to go very quickly through this figure. I'm not going to spend much time. And it basically tells you the green quadrant is where we put all our attention, right? Some things on, nutritional supplementation, healthcare services, all important. They're not unimportant. They're at least a quarter of the problem. The rest of the 3/4 is water, water quality, water safety, sanitation conditions, which affect water conditions, right? Air pollution is very important, and these guys are going to talk about it now, right? Ambient air pollution, right? Food quality, which is declining dramatically in Pakistan. We don't have time to talk about that. I talk about that in other situations. We've done a lot of work on that in the climate report. Pakistan's agriculture is devastated, and it's producing very low nutrition, very low quality food, and will eventually start producing less quantity as well. So it's going to also affect basic food access, right? And then hygiene interventions are critical, which have to do with the basic health structure, right? So it's a complex web of things that have to be done all at the same time. And I'm going to skip, because I've talked about this. Basically, let me talk about this very quickly. What's the state of water and sanitation? Whenever we test water in Pakistan, we've done a lot of water testing under different projects. Now they're doing it under mixed, though anyway, we'll talk about that. The water quality results are a bit problematic. But at least in very reliable tests, at least 30% of the water coming directly from source, which is tube well, tap, mechanized or hand pump, whatever you're using, is already contaminated at source, which means that the contaminant got through into the groundwater system. Where is it coming from? Leaching from bad quality toilets, open drains. If you've all been to rural areas, you've seen all of that. It's leaching right into the groundwater, and you can't see it. You can't see bacteria. So people look at the water and say, like, it's really cool, it's fresh, it's clean, what's the problem, right? They don't know that the water is contaminated, right? So by the time they put it into a storage container, right, then you do a test on that storage container. If it was 30%, it's 55%. In Sindh, it's 50%, and then you look at a storage container, it's 75%, right? Of the water is contaminated bacterially. Nobody's treating their water in rural areas. Or look at any survey, less than 1% of people treat their water, which means that they're preparing baby food with that bacteria water, they're washing their hands with that bacteria-contaminated water, they're washing their food with it, their vegetables, their fruits, everything, right? So we say wash your hands, but if you're going to wash your hands and the water has bacteria on it, not going to do much, right? We've dealt with open defecation. That used to be the thing in the past. End open defecation. That was an MDG, right? We pretty much achieved it. No impact on stunting, because we brought all that fecal matter right into next to the house, right? Running through the open drain. So that's sort of the water and sanitation issue. I'm almost at the end. I want to make 2 points only. Great. I'm going to take 1 more minute only. One is this, which we can go over later. We can talk about it in the question. In Pakistan, urban location and your income provide very little protection relative to anywhere else that we've looked at, right? Why? Because the environmental conditions are terrible, so that even in urban Punjab, which is the best off, highest income quintile, still 16, 17% of children are stunted, which is extraordinary. In Sindh, it's 27%. Highest income profile in a city like Karachi, right? Have other countries done it? Is this realistic? Yes. China halved its stunting rate every decade for the last 3 decades, down to 6-7%, right? Bangladesh, you mentioned, has it done it? No, it hasn't done it yet. It started much higher than us, but it's falling. It's heading in the right direction, right? Pakistan still. Peru started out very close to us. You see, China, Peru, Pakistan really are roughly, it was Pakistan, which means West Pakistan from the time we have data, started out lower than Bangladesh, right? But it's just sitting there, right? Bangladesh has gone below. So other countries are doing it, right? If you do it, what's the cost? Roughly, if we could spend 1% of our GDP on this for a 15-year period, it's a terminal amount, it'll end in 15 or 17 years, it's about $4 billion a year, which we waste on many other things. I don't have time to describe that now, but we've shown those numbers in the climate report. It's an enormous wastage of money, right? If you spend that money and you attend to fertility, which is very important, right? Young girls, I didn't get much chance to talk about it, young girls, repeat pregnancies early in life, higher birth order children are far more likely to, and for girls, your body is depleted, right? Their bodies, they can't handle these pregnancies. So these children are stunted. If you do it, then within 10 to 15 years, you don't just get a much healthier population, you get much higher GDP, you get much higher GDP per capita, you get much lower poverty levels, right? Not surprising if anyone is thinking for 5 minutes about it, because you start producing a healthier population, right? You have delayed birth as you address fertility. Women have fewer children. It's just a natural consequence of attending to fertility declines. And so what do you have to do? You have to look at at least five sectors comprehensively, in the same place, for the same people. address environmental drivers of stunting. I've talked about them. Fix the agri-food system. We can talk about it in the question period. I don't have time to, but essentially you have to improve dietary diversity and quality and sustainability, address the health, population, and nutrition stuff without focusing on nutritional supplements, right? Actually address primary healthcare, right? Which we can do. We have a very nice primary healthcare system in principle. And then these are what I consider somewhat secondary to this so far. I think the jury is out on air pollution. The research is showing at least household air pollution can be really damaging. Probably environmental air pollution at the level of Lahore is extremely dangerous for everybody, including infants. I'm going to stop here. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Let me invite Nousheen.
Nousheen, you need this.
She's going to talk about Lahore, so really relevant to everybody sitting here.
Yeah.
Ghazala.
Okay. Just a second.
I should come here. Wonderful.
With this, I'll go down, right? And this is the pointer. Yes.
Much better. I can see.
Okay, thank you so much, Kulsum, for inviting me to this panel and also for the introduction. I'll be specifically talking about the impact of water contamination on childhood stunting, particularly in some of the low-income communities of Lahore. So, our organization, Action Research Collective, has been working on a project that was focused on studying the water quality mapping. It is a water quality mapping, and we have been collecting water samples from diverse locations across Lahore. So in the initial phase of the project, we focused on two types of contaminants, heavy metal contaminants, that includes arsenic and lead. And the other type of contaminant that we were focused on were microbial contamination. So particularly fecal coliforms. These are the specific type of bacteria that are there in vertebrate gut, and if these type of bacteria are present in your water samples or water supply, it means that the water is contaminated with sewerage water. So these are indicator organisms, not necessarily pathogenic organisms, but we have also tested for pathogenic organisms in this study. So we started this project 2.5 years back, and we started working on this project because we had a clear indication that we were organizing some health camps in low-income neighborhoods of Lahore, and we saw that the prevalence of waterborne diseases was much higher in these areas in comparison to the national statistics that were there. So we started working on this project, and in the last 2.5 years, we have collected over 1,200 water samples from diverse locations across Lahore, and we found that at least there are at least 7 coliform contamination hotspots in the city. So these are the areas where we found that the water supply was contaminated with coliforms. All of these areas could be classified as they are low-income neighborhoods. So I just want to emphasize that we have also collected water samples from DHA, where this university is located. So we collected 55 samples, and none of these samples were contaminated with coliforms. So I just want to say that. And this is area Charar, which lies right in the center of DHA. And in this area, the water samples, sometimes 80, but we have collected samples 3 times from this area. So depending on the time or in the season, so there are temporal and seasonal fluctuations in the coliform numbers. So the number of the affected household goes down or up depending on the season, but the water is always contaminated, but never in DHA. So this is something that I want to emphasize. So I also want, it is not secondary data. we are testing these samples in our lab. So our team goes to these places, we collect data, we collect water, and we test it using different methods, classical methods, and also the modern molecular methods, which is like, this is 16S RNA sequencing. So I'm sure that everyone here is familiar with DNA sequencing. It is a similar method, similar technology in which we sequence the RNA molecule from the bacteria that we have, and it is commonly used to identify bacteria present, like the class of the bacteria which is present in that sample. So we do it in our lab, and then we send selection of these samples to some ISO certified labs for confirmation. So this is like, we are doing that, and we have seen that these are different types of bacteria that we identified, all pathogenic, because when we say coliforms, as I said, these are only indicator organisms, but we have confirmed the presence of very dangerous pathogenic bacteria in Lahore's water supply. We also collected data on other water quality and health matrices across these locations. So this is the data from these 7 hotspots that I mentioned. So you see that these gray bars, they show the percentage of the affected households in these communities. For instance, in Charar, 65% households are affected. But sometimes this number goes up to 80% as well in summers. And in some areas that the number of affected households was of course lower, as in case of Kiryanwala. Now this is the survey data that we collected for waterborne illnesses in these neighborhoods or in these communities. And there was some association. You can see that there is an association between the number of affected households and the prevalence of the waterborne illnesses in these areas. As one goes down, the other, so it's a direct correlation. Now this is another important factor, which is the access to filtration plants, because this is a very a response that we get from water authorities and the water boards. When we tell them that the water is contaminated with coliform, they said, okay, they have a filtration plant at least. So in these areas, in some of the areas, even these people cannot access filtration plants. And if you see, here for Charar, in Charar, 100% of the people have access to filtration plants, but still the prevalence of waterborne illnesses is very high. So there is another additional parameter which I'm not showing here in this graph, otherwise the graph will get too complicated. So which is, as a biologist, it is very important for me, the bacterial load. So number of bacteria that are present in the water supply also varies from one area to another. So in Charar, the number of bacteria is also very high. So as a result, when these people, the residents of Charar, when they are using, for drinking, they're using filtered water, still they're using the same heavily contaminated water for other household purposes that include, food preparation or personal hygiene and hand washing. So we just don't need this quality of water for drinking, but also for these domestic purposes, right? So even if when they're using filtered water, the prevalence of waterborne diseases is not going down. Okay. But today I would, because this is a session on stunting, so I would like to specifically talk about one neighborhood in particular, which is called Sharifpura. In Sharifpura, we have a dual challenge. Sharifpura, the water supply in Sharifpura is not only contaminated with coliforms, but also with lead. So we are not going, I'm not going into details, but the impact of lead and coliforms on human health is already established. Their relationship, there are multiple studies on the impact of this kind of contamination on stunting and other health parameters. So Sharifpura is so you can imagine that in Sharifpura, if these people boil the water to kill the coliforms, the level of lead will go up. So there's no way out for them. And this is the area where the prevalence of waterborne illnesses is very high, and the thing that we have to talk about. But this is one thing that I want to show you. So these are the safe levels of lead in drinking water that are, the safe levels as recommended by different health organizations. And I will show you now the level of lead that we have detected in Sharifpura. I had to draw this graph on another scale to show you that. This is the highest level of lead that we detected in Sharifpura. So the problem is really intense, really severe. So now coming to stunting. In Sharifpura, we have been collecting data on stunting for last 2.5 years now. And I'm just showing you because we are just talking about the children under the age of 5. When we have also collected data for school-going children, and it gets more evident there. It is more like pronounced. This effect is more pronounced there. But this is the green bar is the national data, which I got from the World Bank's website. And the rest of the bars, they show the stunting percentage in Sharifpura for different age groups for children under 5. So if it is 38.2% nationwide, it is 47.9% in Sharifpura. And for some age groups, it goes even up to 71.4%. So it is really a serious problem there. And this is the mean hazard score for these different age groups. We are also collecting data on some of the factors that could possibly link water contamination to childhood stunting. I'm not sharing all the data here, but I just wanted to emphasize on these 3 factors, which is anemia, diarrhea, and premature birth. So the 81% of the children in Sharifpura are severely anemic. The percentage of diarrhea is also very high. Premature birth was not it is still very high, but the prevalence of the women who reported that they had miscarriages was 36% in Sharifpura, which is also could be the impact of lead. We are comparing anemia in these different neighborhoods, and the manifestation of anemia from one neighborhood to another is very different. So, for example, in Sharifpura, the anemia is iron deficiency anemia, which is level of lead in the blood is inversely proportional to the level of iron. So, if the lead level goes up, the iron level goes down. But if we go to another area, which is Chungi Amar Sidhu, there it is vitamin deficiency anemia. So you can just see that it could be the impact of malnourishment, more of the malnourishment in one neighborhood, but in the other area, it could be more because of water pollution. So water pollution is actually in these neighborhoods, in these communities, it is impacting the rate of stunting. And I think that if we have to develop a policy or if we have to address this issue, we have to focus on the vulnerable communities in the city. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nousheen. Over to Sanval, air pollution. I think just before you start, I think it's important to understand that this connection of, if you have multiple accounts of diarrhea as a child under the age of 2, you obviously can't absorb the food. That, actually, the World Bank only had published a paper on that with consultation with WHO and others in 2008. In 2018, Ghazala's paper, which also looked at this, actually took the latest research into account, which showed that actually if you have multiple periods of diarrhea, then even when you don't have diarrhea, the body cannot absorb the food. So we learned more. Now, the interesting thing is air pollution, the research is just starting. So over to Sanval.
All right, thank you, Kulsum. Just a public service announcement. My work focuses on pollution avoidance, not stunting, but I'll try to summarize some of the recent literature on the non-health impacts of pollution and then turn towards draw on some of my own work to show what is it that we can do in Lahore. What I'm going to present, or my comments today, sort of complement the work that Ghazala and Nousheen have presented, and I'll focus on some of the broader risks associated with exposure to air pollution, especially cognitive stunting. Right, so Pakistan experiences horrific air pollution. Lahore ranks among one of the most polluted cities in the world. Many other Pakistani cities are on that list. There's that famous EPIC study. EPIC is that research center based at the University of Chicago, run by Michael Greenstone and his colleagues. And they've released something called the AQLI, the Air Quality Life Index. And we quote that index quite often here in Pakistan and in India especially. And what that AQLI shows is that in Pakistan, an average citizen basically loses 5 years of their life, and an average Lahori loses 7 years of their life being exposed to existing levels of pollution in the country and the city. And as you can see, this is a graph that Isra showed earlier in her presentation as well. The levels of PM2.5, which is the most egregious pollutant, these levels consistently lie above mandated standards. So the horizontal lines here, so the bottom line is the WHO's recommended or suggested standard. The red line up here is our own Environmental Protection Department standard. And our PM2.5 levels are consistently above that level. You can pretty much count on your fingers the number of days when air pollution levels in the city have actually been within those mandated standards, right? The other thing I want you guys to note is that air pollution isn't a winter problem. As you can see, that pollution levels are also quite high even in the summer months, right? Or non-winter periods. So pollution is a perennial problem. It's just we don't observe it as frequently as we do in the winter, and then there's a meteorological phenomena for that, but pollution levels are pretty bad throughout the year. Yeah, and PM2.5 is again. This is work from EPIC at the University of Chicago, Greenstone et al. And they show, and this is also supported by data from the World Bank that Kulsum and I have used in some of our policy work, is that PM2.5 is the second highest risk factor in Pakistan. So it's the second highest threat to life expectancy in the country after cardiovascular diseases. Now, there's a lot of lab and medical work that's been done to show the direct health impacts of exposure to air pollution. But demonstrating effects of air pollution in the field is very challenging. And that's because air pollution exposure isn't necessarily exogenous. So you can think about factors that affect outcomes, health outcomes or non-health outcomes that are also correlated with pollution exposure. So just as an example, you can think about sort of high, middle income individuals, and there's anecdotal evidence that high income or high middle income individuals in Pakistan engage in avoidance behavior, they invest in masks, they might install air purifiers, but these are also the individuals who you would think might have better health outcomes to begin with. So a lot of work that's come out, so existing work and ongoing work, has to rely on quasi-experiments to tweak out the effect of exposure to air pollution on both health and non-health effects. And there's been a bunch of work that's been done on, very famous work that's been done on direct health outcomes, such as life expectancy and infant mortality. But now, recently, there's been this wave of literature showing the non-health impacts using these quasi-experimental methods. And I'm just going to now go through that list of some of the work that's been done before I turn to some avoidance and mitigation measures. All right, so the first study that I want to show you is this recent work that demonstrates that pollution, and this ties into the work that Ghazala just presented, that exposure to pollution actually causes stunting. And this is evidence from India, where you can see this is information that is by, these are effects disaggregated by age. So we don't see an impact on stunting and severe. So, well, stunting constitutes so what constitutes stunting is if you're 2 standard deviations from the average. Severe stunting is when you're 3 standard deviations from the average. So what we observe is that there's perhaps no effect on kids in the first year, but after the first year, exposure, a standard deviation increase in PM 2.5 leads to both stunting and severe stunting. Then the authors disaggregate the same results across gender and birth cohort, no, by birth order, I'm sorry, yeah, so it's by gender and birth order, and what they observe is that if you compare stunting rates across gender, girls tend to have worse outcomes compared to boys, and then individuals or juniors compared to firstborns have worse outcomes. And then they sort of draw on secondary literature to kind of show that households tend to put more resources or allocate more resources towards boys and more resources towards firstborns versus juniors in the family. So you see worse stunting outcomes for girls and juniors versus firstborns. And then they demonstrate how standard deviation exposure to PM 2.5 as it lowers height also has effects on adult earnings. All right, next up is effect on cognition. So this is another new recent sort of study that demonstrates that there is a direct impact of exposure to air pollution on cognitive skills, especially memory. So people who have a short-term exposure to air pollution, they experience a temporary form of cognitive dissonance, leads to impact on memory, and that can lead to, which is in fact non-linear as PM 2.5 goes up. But what's interesting is that these results, you observe these results even when PM 2.5 are within mandated standards. So the mandated WHO standard at 35 micrograms per meter cube, so pollution levels, even when they are within mandated standards, lead to these effects on cognition and memory. All right, yeah, and then they disaggregate these effects across age, and they show that these effects are worse for those under 30, and then improve slightly as you age, which perhaps is not, what they argue, is not related to exposure to air pollution, but more about experience and primarily because of experience as you age. All right, test scores. Standardized test scores also fall when you're exposed to air pollution. And there's a couple of studies, well, there are more, but like I've taken out a couple of recent sort of studies showing, there's one from Israel, another one from Brazil. One uses wind as an instrument wind direction as an instrument for pollution exposure. The other one looks at coal mine closures as a natural experiment to demonstrate that exposure to air pollution actually leads to a decrease in standardized test scores. And then you can see how these results then add up, right? Like if you flunk your SAT, let's say, you perhaps, I mean, even a place like LUMS uses an SAT score for admissions. All right, that's the study from Brazil looking at coal mine closures. And then dementia, right? So exposure to air pollution also increases dementia, and those impacts then accumulate over the long run. And this is a recent study from the Review of Economic Studies. And then Nidell, who's like a guru of a lot of work on the economics of air pollution, he has this paper looking at the New York Stock Exchange, and he shows that on more polluted days, there's much more variation in buying and selling on the market compared to cleaner days. So there's also this kind of impact on the stock market. This is a study by Ann Burton and a co-author. Ann Burton was a Colby undergrad, the institution where I teach at, where Rio did his undergrad too. So this is a little plug for Colby, I guess. Well, Ann Burton demonstrates that she uses data from the US, but what they show is like when there are forest fires and an increase in air pollution, as a result, there are actually more number of fatal car crashes as well as fatalities. And then the last kind of study that I'll show you is on violent crime. This is data from Chicago where you're using, thank you, variation in air pollution exposure, again, using wind as an instrument, showing that like on one side of the highway where there's more exposure to air pollution, you end up with higher violent crimes versus the other end of the highway where tends to be less exposure. All right, so having set that up, so just to summarize, and this links with the work that both Nousheen and Ghazala have already presented, is that here's another aspect to stunting, right? Air pollution exposure is, like I said, it's a high risk factor, it's the second highest risk factor, and it not only has a direct health effect, but also has these non-health effects in terms of these effects on cognition as well as stunting. So what do we do? So this is where like a lot of my own kind of research comes in. I mean, there are two kind of broad avenues for what can be done, and I'm just going to quickly kind of go through those and leave a broader discussion for the Q&A. But first is obviously a mitigation. Which is very challenging, especially given the policy space in a country like Pakistan. A lot of people, and this is something that Ali Chima also quoted a couple of weeks ago in a panel on population. A lot of people think that we can emulate the China example. Chinese cities like Beijing used to experience horrific air pollution as well. But one day the Chinese decided that they're going to fix the problem, and lo and behold, within a couple of years, Beijing started experiencing really good air quality. But the Chinese can really do that because their state is designed for that purpose, right? They can leverage command and control, and they can sort of pull those levers and get those kinds of outcomes that they're looking for. But a state like Pakistan, on the other hand, where it's not as if we don't have strong rules and regulations. If you look at our environmental history, we've got strong rules and regulations on paper. But then these rules and regulations operate within a very weak institutional setting. And so we have incredibly poor levels of monitoring and enforcement. And so a state like Pakistan is not necessarily designed to adequately leverage command and control the way the Chinese were able to in order to achieve their outcomes. So there is now growing evidence, especially from India, where, again, Michael Greenstone and EPIC have done quite a bit of work to try to see what are these little sort of interventions that they can do at a local level, working with state governments versus sort of the federal level, to bring about meaningful changes in mitigation. And one of them is, of course, on industrial emissions. And so a state like Gujarat has recently experimented with the first cap and trade for PM 2.5. We think about cap and trade in terms of carbon, but this is the first example of a cap and trade system, a PM 2.5 cap and trade system in the world with some positive outcomes. The other is so here's a picture of, so the number one source of pollution in cities, especially a city like Lahore, are vehicular emissions. So if you want to achieve meaningful changes in our air quality, I think you have to really think about the transport sector. And on a structural level, really think about the kind of cities that we design. I mean, the sprawl, the way cities like Lahore are growing, is that really sustainable and adequate? So now that's at the structural level, but at a more sort of at a more technological scale, I think one has to think about our recent EV policy and how we can really implement that and bring about that adoption at scale. Crop burning, I'll leave this to there's some interesting work that's been done from India on ecosystem services or payment for ecosystem services that seem to have worked. And the idea is, you give farmers some form of cash payments to stop them from to incentivize them from not burning their crops, and there's some interesting results there. But I'll leave that to the Q&A. But my own work, so and I've just got a minute, so I'll quickly summarize this. But so, you've got mitigation on one side. So if you want long-term improvements in air quality in cities like Lahore, you really need to target polluters. and as I said, that's very challenging. So because of that policy inertia, it's not as if we citizens can just sort of sit ideally. So so somehow we need to adapt. And what we're observing is that if you take, forget about the general audience at LUMS, if you consider like a general average citizen, a Lahore citizen, they have low levels of human capital, they don't necessarily have access to, so 6 years of schooling on average in Lahore, they don't have access to air pollution information, they observe air pollution, but they don't really understand what PM 2.5 is, or how does that operate, or how is it measured. So that's the kind of information space or information challenge that we need to kind of plug. And what we observe is that if you teach people what air pollution is and you provide them air pollution information, and that's work that we've done with Mahanur, who provided excellent support, and I see her sitting in the back, what we see is that people actually have considerable willingness to pay for air pollution information. Close to, so this is the distribution of the willingness to pay. They're willing to pay up to 60% the cost of 4G internet services to continue receiving this information for additional 3 months. And similarly, once people become more informed, they also exhibit a higher willingness to pay for pollution avoidance goods, like air pollution masks. So once they understand that pollution is a problem, you can also get citizens to start buying or exhibit a higher willingness to pay for avoidance goods like that. So I'll end on that note, and I look forward to extending the discussion in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanval. Let me invite the others back onto the panel for the Q&A and put our questions up. Actually, thank you, Sanval, because what Sanval basically, he initially talked about a recent study, because the studies that are looking at air pollution causing stunting, this is in the first few years of life and when the child is in utero, there are very few, and they're just starting. But where there is a lot of research is later in life, how air pollution affects cognitive capacity. So which is all those results you showed, from violent crime to car crashes to et cetera, to memory and test results and so on. So that leap, because Ghazala in her presentation is using actual, what is out there is published research. We know for sure all this happens in terms of water, for example, or hygiene and food and nourishment and so on. So remember, you're always kind of catching up. There's research going on, and that you're feeding that, and then you're getting better and better estimates of and understanding of what's happening. So I think all three presenters gave you a flavor of this, and I actually want to turn to the questions and literally open it up. What do you think? Can one grow with a 40% stunting rate? Anybody? We have a lot of economists here. Only smiles. Come on. Somebody has to speak up. Because essentially what we're saying is that these are children under 5, right? So we are saying that and we don't know how bad that stunting is. It could be really bad, as we were seeing in Shekhapura, and it could be different levels of stunting. But we are saying in 13 years' time, 13 to 18 years' time, 40% of our workforce, of our people, the entire population, workforce and everybody else, is going to basically have, lower cognitive capacity, lower IQ, lower cognitive capacity. Please.
So I don't have an answer to this question, but I wanted to ask, because when Ghazala was showing the figure on, how stunting rates have remained sort of stagnant over time for Pakistan, to what extent is the lack of growth today explained by stunting? I mean, is this really an effect of the persistent stunting that we are seeing, like one of the contributing factors to the lack of growth?
I mean, we certainly can't claim that this is an issue for the future. We already have an issue. We've had a pretty static stunting rate at 40, 45%, as we said, going back to the 80s, right? And then it stayed there. So we already have a population at very high risk. The problem is that that risk is compounding, right? Because it's not just young children who are going to come up. It's an aging population that is compromised in health. Think of the societal healthcare costs. Adult population, working population that is compromised. And now a new generation is coming. And it's intergenerational, which means it's already a done deal for many, right? So if you're age 2, it's a done deal. You'll grow up, you'll have children. Those children are at risk. So for me, the really scary piece is if you don't start now, what are we talking about? What's the length of time for which the disadvantage persists, right? I mean, obviously, you can do things to mitigate it a little bit, right? We know that you can give children stimulation, and that takes care of some of the cognitive issues. We are working on early childhood education. New research, again, emerging, not solid, tiny window of opportunity in adolescence, but huge importance of working with young women, catching them before they become pregnant, right? So we can address, get them tested, improve all their health conditions before they enter pregnancy. So there's lots of stuff to do. There's just so much to do in this domain, right? But yes, it's not an issue of the future. It's an issue of today that threatens to persist in the future.
Thank you for the presentations and kudos for a truly multidisciplinary panel. My question's for Ghazala. I think you mentioned an investment to the scale of $15 billion is required.
Yeah, I'll come to it. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
But given our greatest binding constraint is the fiscal situation.
I love this question.
If you could do only one thing, and maybe you had like $1 billion
so
or two.
So it's $4 billion. It's 1% of GDP, which is the calculation we've done. This is to provide completely safe water, treated water, all effluent treatment, which means full sanitation, right? Context-specific solutions for different environments, and comprehensive behavior change, and what we would need to do to rapidly address fertility, to come to replacement, to accelerate. We're moving there, but very slowly. We want to get to replacement quicker. Rest of South Asia is already at replacement, other than Afghanistan, right? That's $4 billion. Is that a lot of money? Just one number, $2.7 to $3 billion a year is what we are spending on really bad agricultural subsidies, right? These subsidies are actually creating a system that's failing. Land is degrading, productivity is declining, nitrate contamination. I didn't talk about nitrate contamination because of chemical fertilizers. Huge issue, another source of very good research showing the link between nitrate contamination in groundwater and child stunting, right? So it's a system that's clearly failing, right? Land degradation levels are at 0.04, 0.03 now, very, very close to desertification, right? We're dumping more fertilizer there. So that's taking $3 billion a year. The estimates are really good for Punjab and Sindh, 2.2 to 2.7 for Punjab and Sindh, another 2 to 3 million of the rest. All of these are bad agricultural subsidies, right? That basically buys you what you need to do on child stunting, more or less, right? So I think of everything in terms of trade-offs. We haven't even accounted for the other many, many, many bad uses of money, right? So to me, I'm very tired of the no money conversation because I feel like we should only be talking about bad use of money right now, and what we need to shift out of the bad use into better uses, right? But I hope that helps you. It's a 15-year timeline, but look at the cost of not doing anything. I mean, if I had one thing to do, I would do this and education. Honestly, I don't even care about GDP growth.
Please.
Well, considering the impact of this issue, is there any possibility to declare this as a state emergency? And the way we have contained COVID, is there any chances, or is there any possibility to contain this as well?
It's interesting, I was just telling Kulsum this a little while ago. We talked to Punjab PND just last week. Very interesting conversation. They had all the sectors there, agriculture. So, we also took, for the first time, a multi-sectoral team to them and said, here's our ag lead, and here's our environment lead, here's our whatever. And I said, look, you've never seen us together. People come and they say, oh, mera project water. Then somebody else comes and talks about agriculture. Then UNICEF comes and talks about nutrition. Then the World Bank comes and talks about nutrition. So we're really making an effort to stop all this and have one coherent conversation. I think it's worth it. But to answer your question, right, that basically, if you sorry, I lost the thread of the question. Can you ask it again?
National emergency.
National emergency, why was I talking about PND? Because that guy keeps writing me WhatsApps, I was telling Kulsum, since I've left. And the first thing he said was, can we please declare this a national emergency? It was his words. I didn't say anything about national emergency. Sin PND, same reaction. Because when people really understand what's going on, because they've been fed all this conversation about, give them chickpea biscuits and, we need little micronutrition here and a little healthcare there. And then I'm like, okay, you did all that, right? Even the use of the multi-sectoral term. If you talk even to my own colleagues at the bank, when they say, but we are doing multi-sectoral projects, I was like, what's the project? What's WASH? Hand washing and open defecation. What's happening in agriculture? Backyard gardens that nobody maintains, right? So they have these little micro, little interventions, but then they put them all together and then they call it multi-sectoral. That's not what we're talking about at all, right? So so in that sense, I think it's a message that immediately makes people think of that. That shouldn't we be thinking about this that way? So it's not just you. It's like, it was very surprising to me how literally I've gotten 5 messages from him since I finished. He also called up the irrigation department and said, you're throwing effluent in the surface water. The irrigation department fought with him. Then he said, tell me where. So it was like, people are like really worried when they hear this. So I think that we could potentially at least raise awareness. I think that's right now the responsibility.
Highlighting this issue on social media and print media and the journal media will be
Yeah.
better for us.
Yeah, definitely. We're trying actually to build a sort of a national campaign really at this point that can go out on all media platforms. So through television plays, short advertisements, all sorts of media, posters, everything. And I think that would be very helpful, particularly for the behavior change part, which communities can start doing even till we bring water and sanitation to them and other things.
Okay, let's have Iram and then.
Thank you. This is so sobering and so important. One of the things that I kind of gathered last week when I was in Sindh very briefly was that there's a lot of this infrastructure that they've, slowly over time as they get technocrats in and, they get people from the outside to come and advise on these things, they do implement certain measures. So for example, one thing I learned about is that there's an MKV canal, right, that carries effluent, or like they're trying to at least separate the water that comes from drainage and definitely industrial. I don't know about ag. And they're trying to sort of make it so that at least doesn't touch sort of freshwater sources in the Indus and things like that. And clearly that idea came from somewhere, right? Like, so they have been informed over a period of time. I think what I worry about is that this is all really smart intervention, right? Whether it's the testing or whether it's sort of being told that, okay, let's treat effluent water. This is very intuitive. The question for me is that we've already done so much damage by using these inorganic fertilizers and pesticides. And I'm wondering, where was the technocratic intervention here, right? And the bank and others have been advising government in Pakistan for decades. And this is not to put you on the spot as a representative.
No, I'm happy to take
right?
it.
But like, to me, this is shocking that you have some of the smartest people in sort of, doing green ag or doing sort of high yield ag for decades now in Pakistan. None of this is coming internally, right? None of this is coming from agriculturalists themselves. That they are implementing what they have been told top down. Where was this 20 years ago, right? When we were suddenly investing in, and I don't even know the space at all, but like investing in a ton of urea and a ton of sort of fertilizers. I mean, to me, the fact that, I live in Worcester, Ohio now, right? The fact that we don't treat our groundwater coming out of ag areas, to me, is just crazy, And whose idea was this? So can you reflect?
It was normal. Can I answer?
Yeah, could you reflect a little on where
it was
this
Norman Borlaug's idea, and we gave him a Nobel Prize, right? And then we celebrated the Green Revolution, which was not a green revolution. All of this industrial chemicals, to be honest, came out of World War II. The residue of World War II chemical buildup, right? That had to be repurposed. I have no apology for anybody. I think it's been an absolute global disaster. It's caused massive environmental damage globally, including, for example, we very happily had trees that used to line plots of land. Agroforestry was always a part of agriculture, right? Then people were told, cut down all the trees and do monocropping, right? Devastated the landscape, completely devastated land, because monocrop land will die over time. There's nothing restoring. There's no nitrogen fixing going on, so then you have to dump external nitrogen. You can make me talk about this for too long, But I have no apology for anyone. I think it's absolutely criminal what we've done to landscapes globally. By the way, it's not that this happened in Pakistan and who was advising Pakistan. The global estimates now, the estimates for the US are 50 yields away from desertification, right? The largest groundwater reserve, which is in the middle of the country, is sinking at an appalling rate because of the overuse of it, right? 80% of US land is used to produce GMO corn and soy, not for human consumption, actually, right? So it's not just that this happened here or it happened in India, but then something else was happening somewhere else where there was better advice. It's a global phenomenon.
I think, yes, in terms of where agriculture is and in terms of land degradation. The one thing you do see in Pakistan, if you look at the health perspective, usually when countries are poor, they have what's called a traditional burden of disease. You see very high levels of child mortality, malnutrition, indoor air quality, waterborne diseases. And then as countries get richer, they do actually handle those things. So, for example, we do have standards in
public health issues were taken care of.
So, and public health issues are addressed, whereas that is not been the case in Pakistan. And that means, and that's like at a much broader level. So therefore we have this traditional burden of disease, and we have what's called the modern hazards of then air quality and diabetes and everything else. Ijlal?
Thank you all for such a powerful set of presentations and focusing our attention on a crucial issue. So Iram's comment reminded me of something I witnessed in sort of the mid-late 90s, attending a presentation at SDPI, talking about exactly the presence of, nitrogen fertilizers coming in breast milk. You can think of all the powerful examples you can think of, like it's in breast milk. Like, what are you doing to these kids, right? And the sitting finance minister at the time responded immediately about like how they could not do anything that would reduce agricultural yields because agriculture was too important for the country, right? But which brings me to the questions on the board, like what do you do in response? I think if it's framed in terms of we're improving the quality of lives of poor people, we don't go very far. But is this basically industrial policy by another name, right? Can we think of, from what you outlined, and I will work with the numbers you put out there, there's few things we could do that are more essential to sort of not just minimizing long-term health costs, but increasing GDP growth and the country's potential in so many ways. And is that the line that's
the way I'm framing it. Mm-hmm. It's critical to growth. Right? It is, actually. I mean, it's, yeah. I want to say one thing, if I can, on the health issue that you...
you please do, and then let's also get Ali the mic, because he also has a question.
Okay, then I'll
wait. No, say it.
No, I was only going to say that while we are saying that we have our double burden of disease, to be honest, the burden of disease in the US is scary, right? One of the unhealthiest populations in the world today, right? Also, the number of COVID deaths were already a clear indicator of that. Why were they dying? Chronic illnesses are absolutely endemic. They've reached an endemic stage there, and you can call them endemic, I think, fairly. So the environmental degradation is not sitting in one place. It's having a global effect, right? Everybody's at risk. But sorry, Aliko.
So I just want to raise the point that I raised when you made your presentation a week ago or whatever, 10 days ago over here, which is, sort of to run campaigns to increase awareness to do something, so change behavior is a separate thing. But if we think that this is a problem because people lack awareness or politicians lack awareness, I think we're wrong. And I gave you the example. The first speech that Imran Khan made when he became prime minister actually showed CT scans of brains and talked about stunting in water and anybody. When PMLN came into power in 2013 in Punjab, they had constituency surveys done very systematically. And the constituency surveys were actually presented to the key cabinet members of Punjab government. Right. And the biggest issue that was raised in constituency after constituency was the issue of water. That's true. Shehbaz Sharif made a Saaf Pani company. Fine, we can say technocratically the solutions they chose had problems, but that's not the point. Imran Khan had I don't know, Abe something, which was run by Governor Sanval, Abe Hayat company. So the fact is that this has been recognized an issue. And, on the pollution side, we have government shutting down schools. It's not because they're not aware.
Right, right.
And government paying a huge amount of money to create artificial rain, which is a ludicrous spend. But the question we have to ask is, why is this not happening? And I think that goes back to, in some sense, what Sanval said, which is, what we're doing is we're defining standards, we're defining policies, but we are very unable to do two things, which is to create institutional mechanisms which can actually incentivize and enforce standards. And the second thing which we are unable to do, basically, and I think Kabir's point, I would read it in a different way. The question isn't, should this be where we spend the money? Even let's say we have money to spend and it's all already fixed or committed, we can raise the money. We are a hugely undertaxed society.
Yeah.
So the question is, why does the state and the political system lack the incentives to actually create the money to address these problems and bring about institutional change that can embed a lot of these policies? And I think that's where the rubber meets the road.
Absolutely.
So the question is, what we need to push is we have to have a direction on fiscal instruments that need to be created to enable these things. We have to have an architecture which is institutional and in terms of governance that can actually rejig everything. And if we give that direction, then I think civic action and debates can actually coalesce around that vision to say this is the kind of reform that will be catalytic. Absolutely. I think without that, we're going to one thing I decided about 2 years ago, I'm not going to go to any presentation where people are going to present the fact that air quality is bad. Because I can see it. I get out of I live it. I mean, I get up in the morning, I see 3 months of the year. So the question is, where do we go? How do we address crop burning? I mean, what are the instruments? What are the mechanisms? And I think there the debate is completely stuck. And I think politicians, bureaucrats don't have an imagination. But you need to bring that in and you need to push that.
So can I?
Let Sanval go on that first, and then if Nousheen.
Yeah, quick response to Ali's. I'm completely on board with what you're saying. I too don't attend presentations where I'm told that air pollution is, but it is kind of neat to see these non-health effects, which is the new literature, from crime to But on mechanism, in my presentation I said I'll sort of come to some of the stuff that's been done in India, which is pretty meaningful, and there's work now on crop burning from Pakistan as well. Dipapa and Gulzar's work, a recent paper. So in India, with the ecosystem service payments, Punjab government was very willing to kind of work with the team to kind of implement this. And this follows from Seema Jayachandra's work in Uganda, where they actually offered these for a different kind of environmental problem that was deforestation. And then in Pakistan, I think it wasn't a direct intervention. Dipapa and Gulzar have used observational data at the district level to see look at the intra-jurisdictional externality, right? So when administrators within the district see that the wind's blowing away from their district, they're not incentivized to put out fires, and so they let the smoke blow towards the adjoining district. So that but their argument is then how do you kind of leverage those incentives of these district administrators to then kind of internalize that externality? Now, that's a difficult question, but at least you have these tried and tested kind of interventions like ecosystem services and examples on external validity that they're being implemented in India. Is something that we can leverage. The other example from India is that, they're doing great, like I said, a PM 2.5 market. On industries, on industrial emissions, they've started randomizing audits rather than, I think it used to be that originally states used to, at least Gujarat, their policy was that they would let firms hire a third party to do their audits. But here it's the state that's doing randomized audits, right? And so now they're seeing that the Yeah, so you would see a lot of bunching, and when you left it to the firms, they would just pay off the auditors, and you'll see a lot of bunching right at the threshold where they're supposed to be. But now you see like a much more even distribution of like industrial emissions. But to kind of summarize and this is what Anand Sudarshan, who worked with Greenstone on a lot of these projects in India, and he says that you can see examples of specific states in India where the administration is actually willing to work with people like, or institutions like EPIC to kind of think about these evidence-based interventions. But there are other states where they've actually failed. Like they give this example of Bihar where they try to intervene. But I'm not really sure what the governance structure in Bihar is like, or the institutional arrangement. They said they had a very difficult time kind of working with the government, but then they show how both economic and social outcomes they compare Bihar to Odisha, and they show that those both social and economic indicators in Odisha have just gone up, whereas in Bihar, which has become considerably poorer compared to Odisha. But then and their argument is also that, obviously there's endogeneity, but the fact is that the government is really, in particular, some states are willing to kind of be open to researchers and much more amenable to this kind of work. So, right, I'll just end there.
Nousheen, do you any comment on that?
Actually, I also want that we start working towards the solutions. That's absolutely right. But for us, as I have told you earlier, that for us the problem is that when we go to the authorities, they said that the water is clean. So first we have to we have to agree on that there are problems with water, and it is impacting the public health in Pakistan, and especially in these communities. And then Exactly.
That's an institutional problem that you have to take out testing outside Vasa, which is a government thing.
So actually, I want to just refer back to Stefan, because he talked about actually several things, the countries that were the winners. It wasn't, he talked about the exchange rate and how they faced the outside in terms of, and then exported and all, but he said something else that was very important. He said, yeah, they had policies, but it wasn't about the policies. They kept changing them, but they had based on how things were going. So essentially what you were having was setting a goal, and then you were trying a bunch of stuff, and it was the goal that was important. So you were measuring how you were doing, and if you weren't going where you were meant to go, you were changing that. And one thing that is important, which perhaps we haven't said so explicitly here in the interventions, is that it has to take place in that physical geographical area, because there's no point if you clean up the water and you have terrible air pollution, and then you don't get, the food is messed up. Everything that we've talked about, all the girls have to be going to school, it all has to happen in that same geographical area. When you think of the problem like that, it becomes, in a way, a very different problem. It becomes a problem of local, essentially public service provision, but service provision of different types. And then this monitoring aspect, so that everybody knows whether you are going in the right direction or not in terms of your goal. So I think that aspect is important. And if you have that, yes, certainly one can use the fiscal system and others, because people will pay for better quality of life.
Can I just add something to
please?
Just
please
a minute.
Do, and then we'll
so on pollution is, if you look at the Chinese example, again, I said that they can leverage command and control really effectively, but even there, it was this, the central party set targets at the county and city levels, and that's where like the administrators were like held accountable. So air pollution or environment has been devolved to the provinces, but that's not enough, right? A lot of the interventions have to be far more granular.
Yes.
And if you look at just Punjab's example, a lot of the focus, because it's a provincial subject environment as a provincial subject, the focus is just on Lahore. There are like tons of other cities in the province which are like equally polluted. It's just we don't have air quality data from those towns and cities, and the emphasis is just on a city like the metropolis. So that is a serious governance or institutional problem. Like, how do you devolve this sort of responsibility down to districts or like towns?
So Ghazala, you were going to say something, and that gentleman there, if the microphone,
Maybe
he
we
could
take
have
the
a
question
microphone.
first and then
Okay.
I can wait.
Till the microphone gets sent up there. And do we have any others? So that maybe we take a couple, 2 or 3. We'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then turn to the panel to finish up because.
Thank you. So I'm not a science or data person, so please, bear with my ignorance. I'm just it seems to me that both Sanval and Nousheen are highlighting or more concerned about the class question as to how it impacts different communities. So I was wondering if Dr. Mansuri could also talk about, so I get the argument that at the end of the day, everyone suffers. But I'm sure that you have more detailed data which suggests that people, with higher incomes are less impacted by that. So if you could share that. And secondly, I was wondering, why do we necessarily have to frame it as a growth or productivity problem? The question could also be that can we live a happy life with a 40% stunting rate? So I understand that World Bank is more concerned about productivity and growth rather than happy life, but still, that's also one possible framing, I thought.
So maybe I should
Yeah.
answer, because there's a part of your question or your comment that actually goes back to something I was thinking about related to this whole civic action issue and, can we raise, what's wrong with it? Why can't we raise? Part of the problem, there are many problems with that actually. It's a very, very, I think it's a complex problem. But one of the issues is this opt-out issue, right? So some groups can opt out, right? Not of every problem, but for example, DHA, you show the statistics, water's less contaminated. The sewage systems are underground, right? You go to a Kachi Abadi, you go to low-income neighborhoods, sewage lines will be running open, right? Water will be more likely to be contaminated. They'll be buying their vegetables. I just went through a market yesterday where we were driving through to some place, and this guy was throwing water on his fresh vegetables. And the first thought that comes to my mind now is, damn, is that water contaminated, right? Did he just contaminate all those vegetables even if they weren't grown? Because we grow vegetables in sewage water here. So even if they weren't grown in sewage water, he maybe just did a number on those vegetables, right? So here's the question is, the people who have policy, one of the problems of civic activism, people who have policy voice are opting out of the system. They're opting out of the schools, they opt out of the health facilities, they opt out of the public health because they live in neighborhoods where they think they can protect themselves. Which is why I make this claim that, look, in Pakistan, this is only possible up to a degree, right? You go to the market, sometimes you're having dinner somewhere, you get a drink somewhere, where did your ice come from, right? Of course, you go to better restaurants and you make sure that they have ice and whatever, but only up to a degree, right? Your kids are in school, they have something outside, they get it. So the burden will be lower, the burden that you face from the environment will be lower, but it's there. The evidence is that in Lahore, in the highest income quintile, I showed that figure, but I was going very fast, so I think you missed it. In the highest income quintile, in Lahore, in urban areas, in urban Punjab, big chunk of that is Lahore, basically, you still have a 17% stunting rate, right? Okay? And this is among the wealthiest in Lahore. Wealthiest in Karachi, 27%. Okay? If anyone's been to Karachi recently, I was just commenting, if there's 1/4 inch of rain, the sewers are all bubbling over, right? The whole city smells like a sewer, basically, very quick, right? That is the condition in Karachi. Yeah, so that's why, look at the numbers, 60%. Yeah, so part of this thing is, and I think you said this, Ali, a couple times when we were talking, which was basically that that even in the city of London, you were talking about the air quality issue, it took prolonged civic action, right? So you said that they know. I don't think they know. I don't think even the government, I don't think they have a full, so Imran Khan, I know where that thing came from, we provided it essentially, right? That cognitive. He understood this at a high level, but the actual thing, ki karna kya hai, right? That detail was not there, right? And that conversation for some reason never happened, right? But I'll tell you, no, seriously it didn't, because
So the local government reform, which they passed very fast, was designed to.
that's the way to.
But the point is that they scuttle it themselves.
Yeah. Because then other political imperatives come. Yeah.
Saying that if you can configure.
Right.
I'll give you another judgment. Mansuri gave a judgment, which is the Imrana Tibana case, very iconic case, which was overturned by Sakib Nisar. There are two parts of the judgment. One was about local government empowerment. The other was about environment regulation. And he introduced a term in our jurisprudence, which was called regulatory capture. And the capture was that basically the Environmental Protection Department of Punjab also governs the environmental regulation agency.
Yeah.
So he was saying, how can it be the case that an agency that is supposed to set standards over the, distribution, the operational arm of government, the line department, is actually dependent on the line department for both money and appointment of personnel. That was overturned by Sakib Nisar. On that particular thing, I saw no debate in Pakistan. That was a fundamental institutional reset that was going to happen. Nobody debated that detail. Nobody debated the detail that what should be the structure of local government that would be actually delivering the kind of things that you said. Should there be very high local governments? Should there be granular local governments? What should be fiscal instruments that should be given to local governments? These are really important debates, because when you want to institutionalize the Clean Air Act, by the way, you keep giving the example of China, the US did the same. The UK, which is a centralized state, enforced Clean Air Acts through local governments. But what is the architecture? And we have to have an agreement on the architecture that can deliver. If you don't have it, then I think everybody will start saying, "Oh, this is terrible. This is terrible." It'll be one of those days. There's an education emergency. Out-of-school children has been an emergency for the greater part of my last 10 years. Right? I'll probably die with the emergency. So we need to move past it in some sense. So this is very powerful. I'm not saying this is not important. I'm saying this could be the grounds to actually talk about fundamental changes, for which, by the way, I think there's a political demand for this fundamental change.
In terms of a local governance architecture, I think we need to also couple that with social accountability, because otherwise it just doesn't stay over here. We have these local governments and
we
they
really need
disappear.
A regulatory environment, enforcement, and
even
all of it has to
physical
come together,
structure.
and the fiscal resources to do it. To think about how to bring it all together.
Let's have a couple more questions, but I think this is clearly an area, as the bank thinks this through further with
everyone can think
the
it through,
government.
right?
I hope it can be together with a lot of people in this room.
Thank you for the opportunity, and it's a deeply thought-provoking panel. My question was just that, say we get the funding, we get the institutions, the governments, everybody on board to do something about this. And as you've shown that Peru and China, they've been able to grow and deal with stunting to quite an extent. But is there possibly a tipping point or perhaps a critical mass where possibly we can't do anything about it because so many children have crossed that 2-year mark where the damage has been done, or a percentage of the population is already suffering from cognitive stunting? Do we have an idea if there's a percentage or if there's proportion of the population, and maybe that could give us a countdown timer that we need to move quickly, need to move a lot faster on this than we are perhaps doing now.
I don't know about a countdown timer, but look, other countries came from the same level, right? China, Peru were at our level just 2 decades ago. China's down to 7%, right? Sri Lanka was higher and did it at a time when it was much poorer than any of us, than China, Peru, or Pakistan, right? We did it through basic public health measures, right? So I don't think it's about, there's a tipping point and now nothing can be done. It's just that delays are just causing more and more children to live with deficit and societally, for society to live with health issues, right? And you said, can we just not talk about, I hate the GDP metric personally. I was saying this all the time, about why we constantly judging countries on their GDP. It's not a very good metric. We should outgrow it now. But the reason I'm linking the two is because we are spending an inordinate amount of time talking about growth, right? That's all I hear about. That's the poly crisis of Pakistan. 89% of the poly crisis is growth, right? So I'm saying, look, focus on human capital, right? That's your real challenge. That's your real sustainable development challenge. I could have called it, can Pakistan develop sustainably with the 40%? Same issue, right? It's to be provocative. It's to say, look, you're focusing all the time on growth, right? But then we go off and talk about human capital like it's some sort of soft issue, we also need to educate people, and we also need to deal with child stunting and all of this stuff, but it's a fundamental growth issue, is my point.
Right. We have a question here, the gentleman in the green.
Thank you, everyone, and for a very good session. I have a question for Nousheen, Dr. Nousheen. How much of our water problem is linked to our reliance on groundwater? Because we have very good source of surface water, but we are not using them at all. We are totally reliant on groundwater and our facilitation with the filtration plants. I mean, we can clearly treat the source. We can clearly rely on surface water, but yet we are using groundwater and it's depleting day by day. And as you have shown that we are facing different pollutants because of that.
Yeah. So as I don't have any data, but if we strictly talk about coliform contamination, the groundwater samples that we have tested, because in some of the areas, the people are, because the water supply from Vasa or the other water boards is not clean, so they are relying on groundwater. They have like all these plants and everything, and at least it doesn't have coliform contamination. It is another thing that how it is impacting other pollutants, but I'm just talking only about coliform contamination. Up till now, the data that we have, groundwater is clean. It's like it doesn't have any coliform contamination.
But I think it's important.
It is very important.
Can I provide
that actually just it's important to mention though that the groundwater in certain parts of Pakistan is very contaminated with arsenic, with fluoride,
and also with
nitrates,
exactly,
etc. And all those also have a bearing on stunting. So it's not, we may put fluoride in the water to help us, but too much of it actually causes a problem as well.
So again, I'm just talking about water in Lahore. And one thing, if I may say something.
Please.
So if we just talk about your data, the socioeconomic differences between, for stunting. If we talk strictly in epidemiological terms, 17% stunting versus 30 or 38% stunting in the lower, it is like...
Or more.
It is more.
Or more.
So epidemiologically speaking, 17% is like still lower. It is not considered. So there is a factor, there's a socioeconomic factor, there is a difference.
Goes without saying.
And also, if we look at the underlying causes, the children living in these low-income communities, if they are stunted, they are exposed to contaminated water. But in the upper income communities, it could be there could be multiple other factors. We have studies that show that consuming a lot of soda, for instance, can also cause like growth. There are few studies, but they show that uptake of fast food or not taking proper nutrients is also impacting the growth rate in children. So we have to see that in these areas how the growth rate is different. Is it because of water, or is it because of the the nutritional deficiencies due to anything? So I just wanted to.
I think we get back to the physical geographical area at a local level, because I think in a way this. Yes, the poor actually have it worse no matter what, whether it's climate, whether it's air quality, whether it's water, they have it worse. There's no doubt about that. And I don't think anybody is arguing about that. It's how you tackle it. And if you solve the problem by tackling it in the same geographical area, doing all of these interventions, and then because you don't want to fix one thing and find that something else is actually causing, the same problem is going on because, I don't know, air quality got worse or whatever. So I think that's the crux of it. So that then goes back to the point that Ali was making in terms of what is from a governance perspective, the local governance structures, accountability, fiscal instruments to support that. And there needs to be a bit of thinking about this, because just talking about interventions in sectors is very important, but unless it's done all at the same time in the same geographical area, you're not going to get results. So the last question, and then I would actually like...
has been wanting
yeah,
to ask
Dhaka is going to have the last question, and then I'm actually going to ask Sanval, Nousheen, Ghazala to say if there's some, your last two words of wisdom you want to leave for this panel.
Thank you very much for giving me opportunity to say. I'm Takashi Kurosaki from Japan, and I learned a lot from this panel, and I have a question addressed to Ghazala mainly, because in the presentation you summarized the drivers of stunting as first as food nutrition, and then second water, third sanitation, and fourth hygiene and feeding.
Behavior.
And of course, to reduce stunting, to tackle with all of them together is ideal, but of course it may not be possible. Then it seems to me still the first element, food and nutrition, is by far the more important. And actually, it is based on my latest results from our pilot study in Karachi. In Karachi, we intervened in slum areas of Gulshan, Sikandarabad. It's near the Clifton, but very low-income areas and high rate of stunting. And what we did is that we mobilized the community health workers, and they visited mother and the child every month, and then measure the child together with the mother, and we put some growth chart in the house so that the mother and father can see the growth trajectory of the child. And we are able to find that very promising result that 0.42 standard deviation increase in height for age scores, and 10 percentage point reduction in stunting rate. And what we are finding is that home-based monitoring with timing nutritional advice helped. And as a kind of site analysis, we tried the intervention with coupon, because we were thinking that resource constraint is very, very serious for these households. However, additional effect of coupon, we didn't find any. So basically, the home-based growth monitoring worked. So in that sense, close monitoring of growth, focusing on food and nutrition, may be still a very effective tool. And actually, this is based on a Japanese history known as Boshi Techo. Boshi Techo is a special booklet for mother and child, and it served the role of monitoring of the child. So probably this is based on my experience, but I just want to know the opinion from Ghazala.
Sure. So I think what you're touching on is the kind of impact one can have. I'm assuming you're not just growth monitoring. In order to do growth monitoring, some information is being provided, right, about the hazards, about the problems of child stunting and so forth. So you're really coming into this space of what we would call behavior change. You're not in the upper quadrant. You're taking the bottom left quadrant as well in some fashion with one intervention, and you get some improvement, right? Most of these types of things, and many have been done, as you know, alone, right? One intervention produces some change. It's too small to get aggregate numbers to shift, right? So therefore, for me, if you ask me, is it challenging to do everything together? Look, I mean, public health is going to be a massive benefit for everybody. We have to do this, right? You cannot have half the adults here probably have had a gastrointestinal problem in the last, I don't know, few weeks, right? Every time I talk to people, somebody or the other is ill with that, right, when I'm here. You all know it, I mean, for those who live here, right? It's not just the fact that children are sick. Adult labor productivity is being affected by it too. I mean, people are just not feeling that well. There are myriad of waterborne diseases that are coming through basically fecal, but also now other. To the fecal contamination, we've added chemical contaminations, industrial effluents, nitrates. We do have to do this work on public health, right? It is the foundation on which you have to build, I think. And then on top of that, you provide all these other things and that's my view, right? You have to work on that. We don't have a choice but to work on agriculture. At this point, we're going to lose food security and water security within the next few decades anyway if we don't do something, right? So it's not about just addressing child stunting, it's that it's critical, it will improve child stunting, but you got to do it anyway for sheer survival purposes, right? So these interventions that we say have to come together and converge, right? It's that you cannot not address public health and then just try to do regenerative or sustainable agriculture, right? You cannot just sort of like give these supplements to women and do growth monitoring in an environment where there's fecal contamination everywhere, right? There's a lot of new research showing the huge importance of animal waste and babies, right? Animals are living in very close proximity to infants, right? What we call food animals, chickens, goats and so forth, roaming around with their feces. Children are ingesting that. We didn't get a chance to talk about it, but there's enormous research showing that geophagy is in those environments is extremely hazardous for this infant, right? So we have to fix all that, right? You can't just give the mother growth chart. With the growth charts has to come this thing on like, okay, keep your baby away from animal waste, right? Boil the water, right? And all of this stuff. If that's happening, then I think that by simply providing the right information, because it'll take decades to fix the water and sanitation problem fully. It's expensive stuff. It's not just expensive, it's time consuming. I'm doing a project now where we are building infrastructure. It takes a long time. You have to do engineering designs and then infrastructure gets built. It's like a long time consuming effort. We could start a national campaign very quickly, very cost effectively, that would provide very specific information of this type, like specific things you can do. The right way to use aqua taps to chlorinate your water or boil it, right? Very simple things we could come up with 10, 20 extremely simple things. They can cover their drains. Open drains don't have to run through gullies, right? There's simple village level things you can do. Don't leave your solid waste piles with baby diapers on them, right? There are flies everywhere. They come and sit on the infant's food. There's so many actions we could do. So I'm with you. I'm not against what you're saying. But I think that this is encompassing not just food. It's encompassing hygiene and behavior change as well. And it is extremely important to do.
Okay, great. I'm afraid 10 past 6, and I promised 6. So actually the last words from each of our panelists.
I think I've had my last word.
Okay. But Sanval and Nousheen.
I'll let Nousheen go first.
Nousheen,
draw inspiration from her. Yeah.
So I personally think that if we are thinking about an interventional program or a policy or how to address that, we have to basically focus on the underlying causes. If there is a stunting in different groups or socioeconomic classes across the city or the country or anywhere, we have to have design interventional, slightly different interventional programs, because I don't think that the underlying causes for stunting are similar across all classes. That's what I think. Yeah.
Great.
Do you want to say something?
Sanval.
That's pretty terse.
Yeah.
Okay, I need to be short too. Okay. So, like I said, I'm the avoidance guy, and subconsciously I may have escaped to Maine just to avoid air pollution. But I see. Okay, so so this is a paper I did for the IGC and then MHRC at some point, where it showed that the Punjab government devotes less than a percentage of its budget, its annual budget, to the Environmental Protection Department, and the Environmental Protection Department, the EPD, is responsible for everything environment related in the entire province. And they only have 700 inspectors for all of Punjab. So there are trade-offs, obviously, when you think about non-durable services like health, education, environment, right? And a large chunk goes to these other non-durable services. So one way, these are just something that I've been thinking of to reallocate that budget from these other services, perhaps to the environment or the EPD, how do we realign preferences of policymakers with citizens' preferences? And this sort of ties to work that Asad Liaquat did, which I think this is part of his PhD work, where he shows that if you actually inform policymakers on like the actual preferences of citizens or people within their constituency, then there's better realignment on actual public service delivery. And so the work that we're doing on avoidance is that if we actually improve access to air pollution information, when citizens become more informed about the issue, then they're also willing to spend more on receiving, or through behavioral games, we see they're willing to spend more on receiving this public service. So I think that's one mechanism of realigning better public service delivery on the environment with actual preferences of citizens.
Okay. Thank you. Ghazala, anything? No. Okay. I want to make a couple of comments and then just to thank the panel. The first is going back to Ali's point in terms of local, and this is below provincial, whatever that local is, the importance of thinking through that architecture. I think there is a second, and then and putting it in place, and yes, having fiscal instruments, because I think people are willing to pay for better quality of life, actually. Forget about country level growth. Yes, people want that, but at the very basic level, you do want better quality of life. I actually think a key ally, if you will, in this needs to be the health people, because actually in Pakistan, public health is not a very established field. There are some real leaders in this, such as Dr. Zulfikar Bhutta and others, but this is not an established field. In most medical schools and all, it's just not practiced. And actually, understanding and having those people play a role, and particularly getting data and putting it out in the public domain in a specific local area so that one can actually follow these indicators linked with stunting or linked with the various diseases tied with air quality, water quality, etc. I think that will actually help a lot with social accountability and keeping that local government in a way focused on the priorities as was discussed. So I think this partnership is key. I don't think it's just because we've been saying this and not much happens in terms of the local government, but I think linking it with the health people, I think is going to be crucial. With that, I am just going to thank our panelists and thank all of you all for a great discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you.